Hi, my name is Maarten, and I will present this paper on empowerment in child-computer interaction research on behalf of my co-authors at Aarhus University. So what is our paper about? We explored how empowerment has been articulated in CCR research over time. And we achieved this by conducting a systematic literature review of all IDC papers and all articles published in the CCI journal that use the term empowerment. And in our analysis, we determined what type of empowerment is referred to in each sentence. And for this, we used an existing framework that distinguishes between 5 forms of empowerment, and it was developed by Kinula and her colleagues. And the main reason for conducting this study is that empowerment has always been a core concern in the CCI community, even before the community established its own conference and journal. And this quote by Papert provides a good example of this concern. He envisioned early on that computational thinking could empower children to make their own decisions and shape their lives. And we wanted to know how empowerment has been articulated in CCI literature since these early days. And with that being said, I'd like to dive into the main takeaways of our study. So the first main takeaway is that the framework developed by Kinula and colleagues provided a good lens to categorize sentences that use the term empowerment. A few exceptions notwithstanding, all sentences could be categorized as one of these 5 articulations of empowerment that you see on this slide. And what are these exactly? Well, the first one, functional empowerment, includes all CCI studies that focus on providing children with digital tools to, for instance, develop their own games or explore programming concepts. Educational empowerment, in turn, puts emphasis on the development of particular skills and competences that children might need later in life. Democratic empowerment is about giving children a say in technology design processes, whereas mainstream empowerment means providing support for adults, often parents and teachers, who work with children. So children are only empowered indirectly here. And then finally, critical empowerment is about nourishing children's critical stance towards technology and its impact, and is considered the most radical form of empowerment. And another takeaway is that only a few definitions are provided, 5 to be precise in the literature, which entails a risk because although we might use the same term, we're not necessarily talking about the same thing. The third main takeaway is that a shift can be noticed in terms of how empowerment has been articulated. In the early years, there was an emphasis on the functional meaning, but this has evolved towards a more even distribution across the 5 categories and the advent of critical articulations of empowerment in recent years. Which brings me to the last takeaway, namely that several interpretations of empowerment coexist, which obviously reflects the transdisciplinary nature of our community. So that were the main takeaways, and next few slides I will briefly present our systematic review method, but for more details I refer to the paper. So for this review, we first download all IDC papers and all CCI journal articles, and then use the Python script to extract the sentences and paragraphs that use the term empowerment, which resulted in almost 600 sentences in 188 papers. And then we coded each sentence by using the framework mentioned earlier that distinguishes between 5 forms of empowerment. And 2 researchers did this independently, after which we compared results and then obtained an inter-rater reliability of 0.85, which is considered an almost perfect agreement. And as with every study, ours too has several limitations. For instance, we only selected papers from IDC and the CCI journal, and there are, of course, other venues where CCI research is published. But we consider these 2 as the primary international venues for our community. And regarding the analysis, we chose to code each instance of empowerment as belonging to only one primary category, but some instances belong to several categories. Which brings us to the detailed findings. There's no time to discuss all of them, but I will just highlight a few to give you an idea. As you know by now, we analyzed almost 600 sentences in 188 papers. And important to know is that roughly half of the papers uses empowerment only once. And at the other end of the spectrum, there was one paper who uses it 61 times, but that's of course an exception. And in the figure on the right, you can furthermore see the total numbers of published papers, represented by the blue bars, as well as the number of papers that use the term empowerment at least once, represented by the orange bars. And the bottom line is that empowerment has always been a part of the CCI discourse since the first IDC conference, with a peak in 2018 when almost 40% of the published papers mentioned the term. And when we look at the different articulations of empowerment, in the figure on the left, you can see that there's an unequal distribution in how empowerment has been used, with functional and educational articulations each making up for roughly 35%, democratic articulations for 23%, mainstream for 8%, and then critical only for 3%. And when we then look at changes over time, which you can see in the figure on the right, it becomes clear that functional articulations represented by the yellow bars were quite dominant in the first years, and somewhat surprisingly that the critical category represented by the dark blue bars did not emerge until 2016. And as you can also see in the last few years, there's a more equal distribution across the 5 categories. Now, to make this more concrete, I'll give a few examples of different articulations of empowerment in CCI literature. And the first example is a definition by Frere, which fits the critical category of empowerment. And it was actually one of the few definitions that we could find. And the next example relates to empowerment in its functional sense, because here empowerment is conceived as providing better technology tools to help children achieve top-down defined learning goals. And as explained earlier, this is one of the 2 most represented categories in CCI literature. A third and last example refers to the democratic meaning of empowerment by giving children a say in the design process. And this has, of course, always been a hallmark of CCI since the very beginnings. But within this category, a more fine-grained distinction can be made between more pragmatic notions of democratic empowerment and more political ones that emphasize how engagement in design can raise children's awareness about their presence in the world, making it more closely related to the critical meaning of empowerment. Which brings us to the end of my presentation and the question where we go from here as a community. And to recap, our study has shown that empowerment has always been a part of the CCI discourse, but that a shift can be noticed in terms of how empowerment has been articulated over the years. And there are 2 main implications of our study. First, the many different but often unaccounted articulations of empowerment might obscure what we actually mean with the concept. And as a consequence, as a community, we might not provide the service expected by national and international organizations that implement empowerment as, for instance, a central concept in school curricula and policy visions. So in that sense, our findings are a call for action. Without wanting to jeopardize the transdisciplinary nature of our work or taking a normative stance, we think that as a community we could move forward by being more explicit about what we mean with empowerment, who we want to empower and why, and whether we succeeded in that aim. And with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions in a live session.